In the spring of 2009, a county extension agent named Dale Pryor drove his white university pickup down a gravel road outside Harlan County, Kentucky, climbed out, and stood at the edge of a low-lying field that had not been tilled in 42 years. He looked at the standing water in the corners, the sedge grass running thick along the margins, the volunteer willows coming up in a line where the ground softened. And he turned to the woman beside him and said it plainly: "Wetland liability." Those were the words, not a field, a liability. He wrote it in his notebook, tore the sheet out, and handed it to her. He told her the remediation cost alone would run past $50,000, and that no sensible operator would fight that ground when there was workable acreage higher up the slope. He was sincere. He was not wrong about the cost. He was simply looking at the wrong thing. 12 years later, in the summer of 2021, a water broker from Lexington drove that same gravel road and wrote a check for $480,000 for the rights to what that soggy, willowed, unloved field had been producing quietly underground since long before Dale Pryor ever arrived with his notebook. The field held a perennial spring aquifer, pure enough to bottle, reliable enough to certify, and deep enough to sustain commercial yield for decades. The woman who owned it, Vera Combs, was 61 years old and had farmed that land her whole adult life without knowing quite what she had beneath her feet, until a single sentence in her dead father's letter told her where to look. She did not celebrate. She sat on the porch with her dog, a black and tan coonhound named Soot, and let the check dry on the kitchen table inside. The story of how she got there begins much earlier, in a cedar chest her mother had kept in the back bedroom, and it passes through a field that the whole county had written off as a mistake. Let me tell you about the Harlan County lowland, and what a dismissed sentence in an old letter actually contains. Vera's father, Cletus Combs, had farmed 186 acres in the hill country southeast of Harlan for 37 years. He was known for two things: a stubbornness about winter rye that his neighbors found baffling, and a memory for water that everyone else had forgotten to pay attention to. The rye stubbornness was the local joke. Every extension recommendation from the mid-1970s onward said corn and soybeans were the play for Harlan County ground with his soil class, and most of his neighbors had followed that advice, bought the inputs, financed the equipment, and done reasonably well. Cletus had looked at his hillier ground, the slopes that ran thin above the limestone, and planted winter rye on them every year without much explanation. When people asked, he said it held the bank and put something back. That was all he would say. The rye was worth almost nothing on the open market, and nobody knew what he did with most of it. And nobody pressed him hard because he was not the kind of man you pressed. He kept a journal, not a farming journal in the conventional sense, but a ledger of what he called behaviors, small observations about how the land acted under pressure, where water came up fast after a dry August rain, where the ground stayed soft into July when the rest of the county was baked hard, which fence posts rotted faster and in which seasons and which corner of a given field showed signs of underground movement that no surface drainage could explain. He wrote in a spiral notebook with a mechanical pencil, dated each entry with the month and the weather that week, and filed them in order in the cedar chest. He bought a new notebook every few years when the old one filled. He was on his 17th notebook when he died. When he died in 2004, Vera inherited the farm, the chest, and the chest's contents, which she did not read carefully for 5 years because grief takes the long way around. The low field, the one Dale Pryor would later call a wetland liability, had been fallow since 1967. Cletus had tried row crops in it twice, lost both seasons to standing water in May, Anna simply stopped trying. He ran the cattle through it in late summer when the water table dropped enough to let the grass get established, and he let it go at that. In his journal, he noted the field 41 times over 37 years. The entries are not striking until you read them in sequence. Then a pattern emerges that would have been obvious to anyone trained to see it. The water did not come from rainfall. It came from below. It came consistently, at the same corners, in the same volume, in dry years and wet ones alike. Cletus wrote it down each time. He never drew a conclusion from it in print, but in the margin of the final entry, dated October of 2003, 5 months before he died, he wrote 9 words in the margin. This ground is fed by something that does not rain. Vera found that entry in 2009, the same spring Dale Pryor came out with his notebook. She had been going through the cedar chest slowly, the way you do when a thing contains your father's handwriting. The notebook smelled of cedar and pencil dust and a faint trace of the lanolin he had used on his hands in winter. She had opened the chest several times in the 5 years since his death, lifted out the top notebook, set it aside, and closed the chest again because she did not feel ready to find out what was in there. She knew from the weight of them that there were many, and she knew that reading them would be the last conversation she could have with her father, and she had not wanted to use it up. In the spring of 2009, she finally sat down at the kitchen table with soot across her feet and started at the beginning. She read for 3 evenings before she reached the Lowfield entries. They were scattered through the journals the way a recurring thread moves through a long piece of cloth, appearing every few pages, sometimes just a line about the water being up in the northeast corner, sometimes a longer notation about the chemistry of what came out of that ground when the soil was disturbed. Cletus had no word for what he was observing. He wrote around it the way a man writes around something he can sense but cannot name. When she read the entries in sequence, Vera noticed that the water in the corners appeared in the same volumes in 1974 as in 2001, that it came up in August of 1988 during the worst drought in living memory, as reliably as it came up in April of any wet spring, and that her father had noted this without comment. Just the date and the measurement and the notation that it was the same as last time. She was reading the last entry, dated October of 2003, when she found the margin note. She read it twice. Then she walked outside and stood at the edge of that field, in her gum boots, and looked at the willows and the sedge and the corners that held water in a dry April. And she thought about what her father had meant by something that does not rain. She did not call a hydrologist. She did not know to call one yet. She called her neighbor, a man named Roy Vance, who had farmed the adjacent ground for 30 years, and she asked him if he had ever noticed the low field behaving that way. Roy said his grandfather had called it a spring field, not because anyone had ever dug for a spring, but because the water came up. They knew that. They had all known that for generations. They had known it the way you know a thing that has never needed explaining, and therefore never gets explained, and nobody had ever thought it was worth more than a wet nuisance. Dale Pryor had come out the following week. Vera had shown him the journal entries, the margin note, the pattern across 37 years of observations. He listened politely. Then he produced his notebook and wrote "wetland liability" and tore the sheet out and handed it to her. He told her the university's recommendation was to either remediate or fence the parcel permanently from the rest of the operation and take the tax right down. He said that spring seeps were common in hill country and that they rarely produced anything worth the engineering required to capture them. He said the words folk wisdom about the water when he thought she was not listening. He said them quietly, to the man who drove him, but Vera heard. She kept the torn sheet. She folded it and put it in the cedar chest with the journals. If you have ever watched someone hold a piece of ground in your mind for long enough, you know that a certain kind of knowledge takes years to arrive and cannot be rushed. Vera Combs was not a hydrogeologist. She had not studied water science. What she had was 41 observations made by a man who never went to college, but who had walked the same piece of ground every season for 4 decades, and written down what he saw without interpretation, which is a form of rigor the university does not teach but cannot replicate. The journals did not tell her what the water was. They told her the water was consistent. Consistent under drought. Consistent under flood. Consistent in July of 1988, which was one of the driest summers the county had on record, and consistent in March of 1997, which was one of the wettest. Let me tell you what a perennial aquifer actually means, because the word gets used loosely and the mechanism matters here. An aquifer is a layer of permeable rock or sediment that holds and transmits groundwater. A perennial aquifer is one that recharges continuously, fed by a catchment area large enough and a geology stable enough that the water keeps coming regardless of season. In the limestone karst country of eastern Kentucky, where Cletus Combs farmed, these formations are common but unevenly distributed. The water moves through fractures in the limestone, collecting in pockets, and where it finds a path to the surface, it emerges as a spring or a seep. The Combs low field sat at the bottom of a slope that backed up against a limestone ridge, and the ridge was doing exactly what limestone ridges in that formation do, which is to funnel water through its fractures down toward the low ground, where it came up through the soil in the corners year after year after year. Cletus had not known the geological explanation. He had known the behavior. His journal captured the behavior with enough fidelity that anyone who read it carefully would understand the water was not going away. In 2012, 3 years after Dale Pryor came out with his notebook, Vera hired a hydrogeologist out of Knoxville named Marcus Webb to test the field. She found him through a university contacts database. Lena had helped her search online, and she sent him the journal observation records before he agreed to come out, because she wanted him to see the 41 entries before he saw the field. He called her after reading them and said he was interested. She paid for the site work herself, $11,000 she borrowed against equipment. Marcus spent 2 days on the property, drove 3 monitoring wells into the corners Cletus had noted, installed a data logger at each well, and told her he would be back in 3 months to pull the records. He called her from his truck, parked at the edge of the field, and said nothing for a long moment after she picked up. Then he asked her how long the family had owned this ground. She told him. He said that what she had was a Class A perennial spring aquifer with an estimated sustainable yield of 60 gallons per minute, some of the cleanest natural water he had tested in 15 years in the field. He said the observation record in the journals was the most coherent pre-test documentation of aquifer behavior he had ever received from a landowner who was not a scientist. He said it the way you say something when you want to make sure it lands. She sat down on the porch step. Soot came and put his chin on her knee. She did not tell anyone for a while. She needed to understand what she had before she had to explain it, and she needed to be sure because there is a difference between what a single test says and what the ground actually sustains over time. She asked Marcus to come back twice more over the following year, once in the driest part of August, and once in early April when the rainfall had been heavy. Both times the yield and the chemistry held, 60 gallons per minute, dissolved solids low enough to meet federal bottled water standards without treatment. No agricultural runoff in the catchment area because the limestone ridge above the field was wooded and had been for 100 years. Her neighbor, Roy Vance, watched all of this from across the fence line and said nothing at first. Roy was a good farmer, a practical man, the kind who kept his equipment clean and his books in order. He had taken out a $230,000 operating loan in 2011 to buy a new no-till drill and expand his corn acreage. The corn was doing fine. The interest was not comfortable, but it was manageable. He was doing what every agronomist in the county had told him to do: scale up, modernize, reduce input costs per acre. He had not thought about the low field on Vera's property in years. He thought about his own fields constantly, the way you do when you owe $230,000 on equipment, and the margin is thin. In 2014, Dale Pryor came back to the county for an extension meeting at the grain elevator in town. He was presenting updated recommendations on limestone country drainage, which had become a subject of interest because several operations east of Harlan were reporting waterlogging problems similar to what Vera's Lowfield had always shown. The meeting drew about 40 people, which was good attendance for a mid-February afternoon with snow in the forecast. Vera was there, in the second row, in her canvas jacket and gumboots. Roy was there too, in the fifth row with 3 other operators he shared a fence line with, all of them with operating loans and expanding acreage, and the look of men who had bet on the same horse and were watching it run. Dale presented his slides with efficiency and good humor. He had updated his drainage cost models with more recent data from the university's Limestone Country Survey, and his remediation numbers were thorough. He knew this ground. He had walked a lot of it. He was not performing for the room. He was genuinely trying to give people accurate information about a problem that was costing operations real money. When he finished, he opened the floor. Vera raised her hand. She asked him whether his drainage models accounted for perennial spring aquifer discharge in karst limestone formations, and whether the remediation cost estimates he was presenting distinguished between infiltration water from rainfall and upwelling water from underground sources. The room went quiet in a particular way, the way a room does when a question arrives that nobody expected. Dale paused. He went back to his slides. He said that spring seeps were factored in as nuisances to be managed and remediated, not as productive resources requiring a separate classification. She asked whether that classification could cause an operation to incorrectly characterize a significant water asset as a liability, and whether the cost models he was presenting had been tested against formations that produced consistent yields regardless of seasonal rainfall. He smiled in the patient, slightly careful way of someone who knows the answer he is about to give is incomplete, but does not have a better one on hand. He said that spring seeps in eastern Kentucky hill country rarely produced commercially viable yields. He said the words boutique interest, which was not meant unkindly and landed that way regardless, and a few people in the room shifted in their seats, and Vera wrote the words on the back of her program and put it in her jacket pocket without responding further. Roy Vance looked at her from across the aisle and said nothing. He thought she was being stubborn about a wet field that was never going to pay off, and he thought it with genuine affection, the way you do when someone you respect has a fixed idea you cannot follow and you have not yet learned that the fixed idea might be the correct one. The spring commodity markets in 2016 were not gentle. Corn prices fell through the floor in July, dropping to $3.18 per bushel, which was below the break-even point for most of the county's expanded operations. Roy's margins, already thin, turned negative, He sat down with his wife at the kitchen table in August of that year with the books in front of them and worked through the numbers for 2 hours without finding a version of the math that came out right. His no-till drill had performed exactly as the extension models had predicted. His yields were up 4 bushels per acre over his pre-loan average. The agronomist had been right about the method. The method was simply worth less this year than it cost to execute. And there was no adjustment Roy could make to change that because the price of corn was set in a place that had nothing to do with Harlan County, Kentucky. He applied for a payment deferral on the operating loan in August and was approved. But the interest continued to accumulate at the original rate, and he entered 2017 with a balance that had grown by $14,000 rather than shrunk. He was not alone. 14 other operations in Harlan County had taken similar loans on similar advice, and 11 of them were in some stage of financial distress by the end of 2016. 3 of those 11 had quietly stopped paying their input suppliers in September, running on credit they did not have, hoping the markets would recover before the supplier notices arrived. The Extension Office, to its credit, organized a meeting in February of 2017 to discuss refinancing options and market stabilization strategies. Dale Pryor was not present at that one. The people who sat in those chairs were the ones who had taken the advice, and they knew each other, and they were decent about it, and nobody blamed anyone out loud. But the room had the quality of a room where a thing that was supposed to work had not worked, and everyone in it knew it. Vera had been watching the commodity markets with a quiet that her daughter Lena, home from Morehead State for the summer, found unsettling. Lena had a degree in agricultural economics and had arrived for the summer half convinced her mother needed to sell the low field, take the remediation write-down, and put the cash into something with a clearer return. She said as much at the kitchen table one evening, with the ledger open between them. Vera did not argue. She slid the cedar chest out from under the table, opened it, took out the journal labeled 2003, and turned to the margin note. She put her finger under the 9 words her father had written in the margin. This ground is fed by something that does not rain. Lena read them. She looked at her mother. She looked back at the journal. She asked what the hydrogeologist had said. Vera handed her Marcus Webb's reports, all 3 of them in order. She did not explain anything. She handed them over and went to get her coat and walked out to do the evening check on the cattle. She had learned by then that some things landed better when they were not narrated. Lena read for an hour at the kitchen table, with soot sleeping across her feet and the summer dark coming through the windows. She had spent 4 years in an agricultural economics program reading balance sheets, cost of production models, and commodity market analyses. She knew how to evaluate a business case. The first report stopped her at page 3, which was Marcus Webb's field observation notes from his initial site visit. He had written his well placement rationale in plain technical language, citing the fracture zone topography and the specific conductance readings from his exploratory probing at the corners Cletus had noted. He had cited, with clear approval, the observation record Vera had provided him as the most coherent pre-test aquifer behavior documentation he had encountered in a field context. He had called it a genuinely rare example of sustained observational rigor. Lena put the report down for a moment and looked at the cedar chest on the floor by the table. She picked up the second report, then the third. By the time she finished, she understood that what her mother had was not a wet nuisance, not a boutique interest, and not a remediation liability. What her mother had was 60 gallons per minute of Class A perennial spring water on land with a clean limestone catchment and a legal standing that had been painstakingly established by an attorney over 2 years of work, and an observation record going back to 1966 that documented the aquifer's behavior through every drought and flood in that span. She closed the last report and sat for a long time without speaking. She had come home intending to give her mother practical advice about writing down a losing asset. She had been operating inside a framework that measured things in terms of commodity prices, remediation costs, and per-acre return. It was a good framework. It was the framework her degree had built for her. It was simply calibrated for a different problem than the one her grandfather had been solving with a mechanical pencil in a spiral notebook. She said that she had spent 4 years learning to read a balance sheet and had missed this entirely. Vera came back in from the cattle check, pulled off her boots at the door, and said she had spent 5 years with a cedar chest in the house before she read it carefully herself. They sat with that for a moment, and then Vera made coffee, and they stayed up until almost midnight talking about what came next. What came next was a water rights assessment attorney named Hugh Beale out of Lexington, who had spent 15 years doing exactly this kind of work, and who had a reputation for telling landowners things they did not want to hear as clearly as things they did. Lena had found him through a contact at the University Extension Water Law Clinic, which was a program that had existed for 8 years without Vera knowing it existed, which is the way most useful programs run in rural counties. Hugh drove out in September of 2016, walked the property in his good boots, and asked Vera to show him every parcel boundary, every watershed line, and every fence post from the property's legal description. He spent 4 hours on the ground before he said anything about what he thought she had. What he told her, standing at the northeast corner of the low field with a property map folded in his hand, was that the water question was not as complicated as it might have been in other formations or other states. The spring aquifer was on her property. Its primary recharge zone, the limestone ridge and its slopes, was on her property. The fracture pathways Marcus Webb had mapped terminated on her land or ran entirely beneath it. Under Kentucky groundwater law, the water was hers. The question was not ownership. The question was documentation and defensibility, which was what Hugh's work would establish. He spent the better part of 2017 building the case record, assembling mineral rights confirmations, watershed boundary surveys, a registered catchment area analysis, and a state water quality certification that took 6 months to come back clean. Hugh's fees ran $38,000. Vera paid them from a second equipment lien and did not flinch. Lena had tried once to suggest that $38,000 was a significant number. Vera had pointed at the cedar chest and not said anything, and Lena had not raised it again. By the spring of 2018, she had a certified water rights package and a sustainable yield certification from Marcus Webb, updated once more, still holding at 60 gallons per minute, still clean, still consistent. The dissolved solids reading had not moved appreciably across 6 years of testing. The yield had not dropped in drought or risen in flood. It was exactly as Cletus's journals had described it, which was to say was the most reliable thing on the property. She sent the certified package to 4 regional water brokers with a cover letter that described the formation, the observation history, the yield certification, and the rights documentation in that order. 3 did not call back. The 4th, a woman named Diane Kurtz, who ran a brokerage out of Lexington, drove out to Harlan County in June of that year in a car that was not built for gravel roads and walked the low field in shoes that were not built for spring-fed corners. She got muddy at the northeast corner and did not seem to mind. She looked at the willows, the sedge, the monitoring well cap, and the wooded limestone ridge above, and she stood for a long time saying nothing at all which Vera recognized as the same thing Marcus Webb had done 6 years earlier, and which she understood by now as a particular kind of attention. Diane asked one question, at the edge of the field, looking at the corners that held water in a dry June. She asked how long it had been running. Vera told her about the 41 journal entries. She went back to the truck and got the 2003 notebook and showed Diane the margin note. Diane read it. She read it again, holding the notebook carefully at the spine. She looked at the field and she looked at the ridge above it, the old wooded limestone slope that had been feeding the formation since before anyone in the county was alive to notice it. And she said that she had been brokering water rights in Kentucky for 14 years, and that what Vera had brought her was unlike anything she had fielded before, and that she would need to take the documentation back to her office before she said anything about figures. She came back in September with an initial offer that was larger than Vera had expected and smaller than Lena thought was appropriate, which is the correct shape for an opening offer. Vera set it on the table and did not respond for 31 days because Lena had told her to wait at least 30, and Lena was right about the timing. In March of 2019, Diane came back with a revised figure and a letter of intent from a regional beverage company that had been looking for a Kentucky source for 3 years and had not found one that met its water quality standards for a Heritage Label product line. The letter was specific about what it required. Class A perennial source, documented stable yield, clean limestone catchment with no agricultural runoff, and a rights structure that would survive a 30-year production horizon. Vera and Lena sat with Hugh Beal for 2 days going over the terms. The rights were structured as a long-term lease rather than an outright sale, which meant the land stayed in Vera's name, and the water revenue came in annually rather than as a single payment. But the 2021 transaction, the one that produced the $480,000 figure, was the lump sum buyout of the first phase of that lease, converted at a negotiated rate when the beverage company decided to acquire the rights outright rather than continue leasing. The land itself had not sold. The land was still Vera's. The water was what had value, and the water had not gone anywhere. $480,000. The number sat on the kitchen table for a full day before Vera deposited it. The folded sheet from Dale Pryor's notebook, the one that said wetland liability, was still in the cedar chest. She did not take it out. She did not need to. The number was the answer to it. Soot was asleep under the table when Vera came back from the bank. She sat down in her chair and let him put his head on her boot, and did not do anything in particular for a while. Dale Pryor heard about it through the extension networks. He drove out to Harlan County in the fall of 2021 and called Vera from the gravel road and asked if she would see him. She said yes. He parked his truck at the field gate and walked out to where she was standing with Lena, both of them looking at the monitoring well Marcus Webb had capped cleanly at the northeast corner. Dale stood for a moment and looked at the field, which had not changed in appearance at all. The willows were a little taller. The sedge was still thick. The corners were still soft in a dry October. He said he had been wrong about what the field was. Vera said she knew. He asked how she had known to look. She told him about the 9 words in the margin. He asked if he could see the journal, and she brought it out from under the truck seat, where she had put it that morning, knowing he might ask. He read the entry. He read the margin note. He stood for a while looking at the 41 entries in sequence, the way Vera had done in 2009 when she first read them in order. He said that the observation record was something he had not seen a farmer produce before. He said it quietly and without qualifications, which was different from how he had spoken the last 2 times he stood at that field. He asked if he could bring a graduate student out the following spring to study the journal methodology. Vera said she would think about it. She said it the way someone says it when they mean yes eventually, but not quite yet. Lena had been standing behind them during this exchange, and after Dale's truck was gone, she walked to the northeast corner of the field and stood at the monitoring well cap and looked at the limestone ridge above. She had studied water economics. She knew that what she was looking at was not just a field, but a formation that predated every human decision ever made about this acreage. A system that had been running underground since the Appalachian limestone was laid down and had not required a single human intervention to keep running. Her grandfather had noticed it. Her mother had inherited the noticing. She had come home from college and nearly talked her mother into selling it for a write-down. She thought about that for a while. The following spring, she enrolled in a certificate program in hydrogeology at Eastern Kentucky University. She continued running the farm with Vera. She and Lena both went to the extension meeting in Harlan that March, where the new presenter, a younger woman from the university's Water Resources program, gave a talk that included a case study about perennial aquifer identification in karst formations. The case study used no names and gave no specifics, but Lena recognized the topography immediately and did not say anything about it to the woman beside her until they were in the parking lot. Roy Vance had been at that meeting too. He had finished paying off the operating loan in 2020, 4 years late, and with $11,000 more in interest than the original note had called for. He was back to a workable margin. He was not bitter about it. He was the kind of man who filed his experience and tried to learn from it rather than assign blame, which is a form of intelligence that does not require a degree. After the meeting, he stopped Vera in the parking lot and asked her to walk him through what she had done, from the cedar chest to the water broker, in the right order. She told him all of it. He listened without interrupting. He said he had always thought that wet ground in the corner of a field was a problem to manage, and it had never occurred to him to ask what was feeding it. Vera said it had not occurred to her either until she read the margin note. He said his grandfather had called a seep on his east boundary a nuisance spring and fenced it off in 1971. It had been seeping into the creek since then. He asked if she thought a hydrogeologist was worth talking to. She gave him Marcus Webb's card. By the end of 2022, 4 other operators in Harlan County had contacted water rights attorneys. 2 of them had features on their properties that tested well enough to pursue. Neither produced a formation as consistent or as clean as the Combs Low Field, but one produced a sustainable yield certification that opened a conversation with a municipal water authority in Letcher County that was looking for supplemental sources. The conversation was still ongoing. The other produced a smaller formation whose best use turned out to be a private agricultural water supply that saved the operation $22,000 a year in irrigation costs. Small numbers compared to $480,000. Not small numbers compared to nothing. Vera had the cedar chest refinished in 2022. Not restored, just cleaned and tightened. The cedar oil worked back into the joints so it would hold another generation. She put the journals back in order, with the water rights documentation, and Marcus Webb's 3 reports and Hugh Beale's final invoice filed in a folder at the top. The 2003 journal was on top of the stack. She put Lena's hydrogeology certificate program enrollment letter in the folder as well, so that whoever opened the chest next would find the observation record and the legal record and the learning record all in the same place. She did not put Dale Pryor's torn sheet in. She had kept it for 12 years in the cedar chest, and she thought about it carefully. And then she took it out and set it on the kitchen table and left it there. It was not a document she needed to preserve. It was a document she had already answered. Soot was old by then, gray around his muzzle, and he spent most evenings on the porch with his nose toward the low field, reading whatever it was the cool air carried up from the wet corners. Vera sat with him on the good evenings and watched the light go off the limestone ridge, that long wooded slope that had been sending water down through its fractures since before the county existed, since before the state existed, since before anyone walking on top of it had thought to write down what they saw. There are two kinds of knowledge that live on a piece of agricultural ground, and they have always been in some tension with each other. One kind arrives from outside, from a university extension office, a slide deck, a cost-benefit analysis, a remediation estimate written on a torn sheet of paper and handed over a fence line. That knowledge is real. It is grounded in data and in method and in systems built to measure what they can reach. Dale Pryor was not a bad man. He was a trained man, sincerely trying to help, operating inside a framework that measured standing water as a cost and had not yet built the tools to ask what was making the water stand. The other kind of knowledge grows from the ground up. It is accumulated in a spiral notebook, one season at a time, without a hypothesis and without a conclusion, just a record of what the land does when nobody is performing for it. Cletus Combs did not know what an aquifer was in any technical sense. He knew that his low field was fed by something that did not rain, and he wrote it down, and he put the notebook in a cedar chest, and he died, and his daughter read it slowly in her grief, and eventually she understood what he had seen. What a system cannot measure, it tends to classify as a liability. That is not a failure of the system's intelligence. It is a failure of its instruments. The instruments Dale Pryor carried on that first visit were calibrated for costs and remediation, not for what the ground below the costs was doing. No instrument he owned could read 41 observations made over 37 years by a man with a mechanical pencil who had learned to watch his own land without needing to name what he was watching. The cedar chest is the instrument the university does not issue. The journal inside it is the data the spreadsheet does not capture. And the 9 words in the margin, the ones that sent Vera to the northeast corner with a question rather than a write-down, were worth, in the end, more than $480,000 because they were worth every answer that came after them. What is rigid measures only what it already knows how to measure. What is patient watches until it understands what the ground is actually saying. Soot lay at Vera's feet in the late October light, and the ridge held its color until the sun was gone, and the low field kept on doing what it had always done, which was hold the water that came up from below and wait for someone to notice it was there,